Into the white darkness, the last great voyage of the Endurance. Prologue: The Screaming Timber. October 27, 1915. The Weddell Sea, Antarctica. The sound was not mechanical. It was biological. It was the sound of a living thing screaming in agony. Inside the crushed hull of the Endurance, 28 men and 49 dogs listened in the freezing dark. The noise was the groan of massive oak beams 2 feet thick, snapping like matchsticks under the pressure of millions of tons of ice. The temperature was minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 26 degrees Celsius. Sir Ernest Shackleton, a man whose ambition was as vast as the frozen continent he sought to cross, stood on the heaving deck. He looked at his captain, Frank Worsley. They didn't need to speak. The ice had won. The ship, which had been their home, their fortress, and their only ticket back to civilization for 10 months, was dying. "She's going, boss," Worsley said quietly. "So it seems. Time to get the men off." At that moment, on a shifting ice floe thousands of miles from the nearest human settlement, with no radio, no hope of rescue, and winter closing in, the mission changed. It was no longer about crossing the continent. It was about something much harder. It was about keeping 28 men alive in the most hostile environment on Earth. Chapter 1: The Ambition and the Trap. August 1914, Plymouth, England. To understand the tragedy, one must understand the hubris. The world was on the brink of the First World War, but Sir Ernest Shackleton was looking south. The North Pole had been conquered by Peary, or Cook, depending on who you believed. The South Pole had been claimed by Amundsen, leaving the British hero Robert Falcon Scott frozen to death in his tent. The heroic age of Antarctic exploration was ending, but Shackleton wanted one last prize: the Imperial Trans-Antarctic expedition. The goal was audacious: to land on the Weddell Sea coast and march entirely across the continent to the Ross Sea. He purchased a ship, the Polaris, and renamed her Endurance, after his family motto, Fortitudine Vincimus, by endurance we conquer. But nature does not care for mottos. By January 1915, the Endurance had battled her way deep into the Weddell Sea, a treacherous swirling gyre of pack ice. They were within 80 miles of Vassal Bay, their landing point. The men could almost smell the land. Then the temperature dropped. The wind shifted. The ice, instead of breaking up, began to knit together. Over the course of a few days, the water vanished. The Endurance was no longer a ship floating in the sea. It was a speck of wood encased in a solid continent of floating ice. They were beset, trapped. For months they drifted north with the pack ice, powerless. The men played soccer on the ice, put on theatrical shows, and tended to the dogs. They waited for the Antarctic spring to melt the ice and free them. But the spring of 1915 brought pressure, not release. The ice floes began to grind against each other, rafting up into jagged ridges. The Endurance was caught in a vise. On October 27th, the pressure became too much. The stern rose into the air, the rudder was ripped off, and the freezing water poured in. Shackleton gave the order: abandon ship. They pitched their tents on the unstable ice floe. That night they watched as the lights of the Endurance blinked out, one by one, as she sank beneath the crushed ice. They were alone. Chapter 2. Patience Camp. December 1915 to April 1916. Imagine living on a sheet of glass that could crack at any moment, floating over 10,000 feet of black ocean. The crew established Ocean Camp and later Patience Camp. The name was apt. They had 3 lifeboats salvaged from the ship, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills. They had limited rations, pemmican, a mixture of dried meat and fat, powdered milk and sugar, and they had the penguins and seals they could hunt. But as the weeks turned into months, the game disappeared. Starvation began to stalk the camp. The flour ran out. The fuel, blubber from seals, ran low. Sir Shackleton, known to the men simply the boss, knew that morale was as important as food. He gave up his own warm mittens to a shivering photographer, Frank Hurley. He ordered the cook to serve extra heavy meals on calm days to keep spirits up, even if it depleted their stores. He kept a strict routine, but the hardest decision was yet to come. The dogs. They required too much food. The seals were gone. In a heart-wrenching sequence of events, the order was given. The teams were taken behind ice hummocks, one by one, and shot. The men wept. For many, eating the dog meat later was the only thing that kept them from starvation, a grim reality of survival that still chills historians today. By April 1916, the ice floe they were living on, originally miles wide, had disintegrated into a triangle of ice hardly 100 yards across. They could feel the swell of the open ocean beneath their feet. The ice was breaking up. On April 9, 1916, the floe split right through the camp. "Launch the boats!" Shackleton roared. Chapter 3. The Hell of the Open Boat. This was not a journey. It was a week-long nightmare. 28 men crammed into 3 small open lifeboats. They were rowing through the churning, freezing waters of the Southern Ocean, dodging massive icebergs that loomed like skyscrapers in the fog. They were aiming for Elephant Island, a desolate rock jutting out of the ocean. It was the nearest land, but land was a generous term. The conditions were horrific. Spray froze instantly on contact with their clothes, turning their gear into suits of armor. They had to chip the ice off the gunnels to stop the boats from becoming top-heavy and capsizing. They slept in shifts, curled up in the bottom of the wet boats, lying in freezing slush. Thirst became their greatest enemy. Their saltwater spray caked their lips. Their tongue swelled in their mouth. They had to chew on raw seal meat to extract blood for moisture. Shackleton, in the James Caird, did not sleep. He stood at the stern, eyes scanning the dark water, guiding the small fleet. At one point, he saw a line of white clearing the darkness above. "It's clearing, boys!" he shouted. A moment later, he realized the horror. It wasn't the sky clearing. It was the white foam of a massive rogue wave. "Hold on! For God's sake, hold on!" The wave crashed over them, burying the boat. For an eternity they were underwater. Miraculously, the James Caird resurfaced, half full of water. They bailed for their lives, flinging the water back into the sea with anything they could find: sleeping bags, pots, hats. After 7 harrowing days, the cliffs of Elephant Island appeared through the mist. They had made it. As the keels grated against the pebble beach, men stumbled out and fell to their knees. Some tried to drink from a glacial stream, but found their throats too swollen to swallow. It was the first time they had stood on solid land in 496 days. But their safety was an illusion. Chapter 4. The Impossible Voyage. Elephant Island was a purgatory. It was swept by gales, covered in guano, and far outside any shipping lanes. No one was coming for them. They would freeze or starve to death there. Shackleton realized there was only one hope. He had to take a small boat and sail to South Georgia Island. The stats of the impossible. Distance, 800 miles, 1,300 kilometers, across the wildest stretch of ocean on Earth, the Drake Passage. The vessel, the James C. Caird, a 22-foot lifeboat raised with makeshift sides made of crate lids and canvas. The crew, Shackleton, Captain Worsley, the navigator, Tom Crean, the toughest Irishman in the Antarctic, and 3 others, Chippy McNeish, the carpenter, John Vincent, and Timothy McCarthy. The stakes: if they sank, the 22 men left behind on Elephant Island would die. On Easter Monday, April 24, 1916, they launched. For 16 days they were battered by a hurricane. The waves were described by Worsley as Cape Horn rollers, 60 feet high from trough to crest. The little boat was tossed like a cork. Worsley's navigation during this voyage is considered a miracle of maritime history. The sky was constantly overcast. He had to navigate by the sun, but the sun rarely appeared. He had to hug the mast, with 2 men holding him steady, waiting for the boat to crest a wave so he could snap a quick sextant reading of a star through a break in the clouds. If his calculation was off by 1 degree, they would miss the island and be swept out into the Atlantic to die. The water turned their skin white and soggy. Their legs chafed until they bled. They had to chip ice off the ropes every hour. On the 7th day, a massive gale struck. The boat was icing up. The weight of the ice was sinking them. In the pitch black, Shackleton saw the glitter of the ice on the canvas deck. He grabbed an axe. Crawling on to the slippery, heaving deck, he hacked away the ice while the ocean tried to buck him off into the dark. On May 8th, through a rift in the mist, they saw black cliffs. South Georgia. But the sea wasn't done. A hurricane hit just as they approached the coast. For 9 hours they battled hurricane-force winds that threatened to smash them against the rocks. They were so close they could hear the roar of the breakers. Finally, the wind shifted. On May 10th, 1916, they crash-landed in King Haakon Bay. They dragged the boat up the beach and collapsed. They were alive. Chapter 5. The Crossing. The story should end here, but fate was cruel. They had landed on the wrong side of the island. The whaling stations and rescue were on the north coast. Between them and the stations lay the interior of South Georgia, a jagged spine of glaciers and mountains that had never been crossed by man. The boat was too damaged to sail around. Shackleton took Worsley and Crean. They took a carpenter's axe, 50 feet of rope, and put screws from the lifeboat into the soles of their rotting boots for grip. They left the other 3 weakened men under the overturned boat and began to climb. For 36 hours they marched without sleep. They climbed peaks only to find sheer cliffs on the other side, forcing them to retrace their steps. Fog rolled in. Night fell while they were atop a razorback ridge. If they stayed, they would freeze. If they climbed down slowly, they would freeze. Shackleton made a decision that defied all mountaineering logic. He said, "We have to slide." They sat on their coiled ropes like sleds, locked their arms around each other, and launched themselves into the misty void. They plummeted thousands of feet in seconds, speeding through the dark, not knowing if rocks or a precipice waited for them at the bottom. They slowed to a halt in a bank of soft snow. They stood up, shook hands, and kept walking. At 7 a.m., they heard a sound that stopped them in their tracks. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the ice. It was the steam whistle of the whaling station at Stromness, the sound of the 7 o'clock shift starting, the sound of humanity. Epilogue. All safe, all well. When the three men walked into the Stromness whaling station, they looked like monsters. Their hair hung to their shoulders, matted with blubber and salt. Their clothes were rags. They smelled of death and seal oil. The station manager looked at them. He said, "Who the hell are you?" The man in the center straightened his back. Despite the rags, he held himself with the dignity of a commander. He said, "My name is Shackleton. We have lost our ship." It took 4 attempts and 4 different ships to get back to Elephant Island through the pack ice. Finally, on August 30th, 1916, on board the Chilean tug Yelcho, Shackleton spotted the tiny beach. He peered through his binoculars, counting the tiny figures waving frantically on the shore. He counted aloud, his voice trembling. 1, 2, 3. He lowered the binoculars and turned to Worsley, tears streaming down his face. "They are all there, Skipper. They are all there." 28 men had gone into the ice. 28 men had returned. In a world that was currently tearing itself apart in the trenches of World War I, where millions were dying for inches of mud, the survival of the Endurance crew stood as a shining beacon of human spirit. It remains, to this day, the greatest survival story ever told. Notable facts for the reader. The photographer, Frank Hurley, dove into the freezing water of the sinking ship to rescue his glass plate negatives. The photos of the Endurance crushed in the ice are some of the most famous images in history. The navigator, Frank Worsley's navigation, is still studied by sailors. Navigating a small boat in a hurricane with a sextant is considered nearly impossible. The carpenter, Harry Chippy McNeish, was vital to their survival. He built the boat modifications, but he rebelled against Shackleton on the ice. Because of this, Shackleton denied him the Polar Medal on return, a controversy that lasts to this day. The legacy. Shackleton never reached the pole, but his grave in South Georgia reads a quote from poet Robert Browning, "I hold that a man should strive to the uttermost for his life's set prize." Chapter 6. The Night That the World Ended. October 27th, 1915, 5 p.m. The death of a ship is not a quiet event. It does not simply fade away, it fights. For the 28 men aboard the Endurance, the sound was the worst part. It wasn't just the creaking of timber, it was a sonic assault. The ice, millions of tons of it driven by the relentless pressure of the Weddell gyre, had the ship in a stranglehold. The noise sounded like heavy artillery fire. Crack, boom, screech. Inside the wardroom, the floorboards were bowing upwards, snapping like twigs. The massive lateral beams, solid oak designed to withstand oceans, were bending like green saplings. Frank Wild, Shackleton's second-in-command, a small wiry man with a chain-smoker's rasp, pushed his way through the tilting corridor. He found Shackleton on the aft deck, looking down into the engine room. The engine room was a scene from hell. The ship was being twisted, literally corkscrewed by the ice. The distinct sound of iron plates buckling screamed through the air. The water was rising. "She's going, boss," Wild said. It wasn't a question.
Shackleton didn't look away from the destruction immediately. He was watching his dreams be crushed, quite literally. Every beam that snapped was a mile added to their journey home. Finally, he turned to Wild. His face was pale, but his voice was steady, devoid of the panic that was rising in the throats of the younger sailors. Get the men off, Wild. Everything essential. Food, sleeping bags, the dogs. Leave the rest. The evacuation. The next hour was organized chaos. The temperature was plummeting to minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 26 degrees Celsius. The order to abandon ship strips a man of his identity. Suddenly, the hierarchy of the Navy dissolves into the hierarchy of survival. The carpenter, Chippy McNeish, was no longer fixing a ship. He was tearing planks off the deck to make runners for the lifeboats. The cook, Charles Green, wasn't preparing a banquet. He was frantically shoving pemmican and flour into canvas sacks. The dogs were the most confused. Sensing the anxiety of their masters, the husky wolf mixes began to howl, a mournful, unified cry that echoed off the icebergs. They were hauled down the wooden gangplanks onto the jagged ice floe. Frank Hurley, the expedition photographer, did something irrational, yet historically vital. As the beams above his darkroom began to splinter, he dove into the sinking hull. He waded through waist-deep, freezing slush to rescue his sealed tin of glass plate negatives. "Hurley, you madman!" Worsley shouted, grabbing him as he emerged, shivering and blue. "I had to get them," Hurley chattered, clutching the tin. "If we die, these don't matter. But if we live, the world must see this." By 8 p.m., the Endurance was a wreck. Her stern was high in the air, her bow buried in the slush. The rigging hung loose like the webs of a dead spider. The men stood on the ice, looking at their broken home. They were 1,100 miles from the nearest human being. Chapter 7. The Gold and the Bible. October 28, 1915. Dump Camp. They called it Dump Camp because that's what it was, a pile of refuse on a frozen sheet of ocean. They pitched their tents on the unstable floe. The ice was alive. It groaned and shifted beneath their sleeping bags. No one slept that first night. The shock was too profound. They were no longer explorers seeking glory. They were refugees, fighting for their next breath. The next morning, Shackleton made a move that would define his leadership style for generations to come. He knew that to survive, they had to travel light. Every ounce of weight mattered. But more importantly, he had to shatter their psychological attachment to the civilized world. He called the men to the center of the floe. He stood on a crate, wearing his fur parka, looking at the ragtag group. "We are going to march," Shackleton announced. "To do that, we must be light. Anything that is not food or survival gear must be discarded. No exceptions." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy gold watch and a gold cigarette case. He held them up so everyone could see the glitter against the stark white snow. "These are useless here," he said. With a casual flick of his wrist, he tossed the gold into the snow. It disappeared into a crack in the ice. He then pulled out a handful of gold sovereigns, coins. He threw them after the watch. The message was violent in its clarity. Money means nothing. Status means nothing. Only survival matters. The men watched, stunned. Then, one by one, they began to follow suit. Silver frames, extra clothes, books, musical instruments, heaps of personal treasures were thrown onto the ice. Then Shackleton picked up his Bible. It was a gift from Queen Alexandra, inscribed by her hand. It was heavy. "I will keep this," he said. tearing a single page out, the page with the 23rd Psalm and a verse from Job. Out of whose womb came the ice, and the hoary frost of heaven, who hath gendered it? He folded the page into his pocket and placed the heavy Bible on the snow to be left behind. Now, he said, turning to the sledges, we work. Chapter 8. The Long Wait. January 1916. The Drift. They could not march. They had tried. For a week after abandoning the ship, they harnessed themselves to the heavy lifeboats, dragging them over the torture garden of the ice. The surface wasn't smooth like a skating rink. It was a chaotic jumble of pressure ridges, walls of ice 10 feet high that had to be hacked through with pickaxes. After 7 days of back-breaking labor, dragging boats that weighed over a ton, they looked at their sextant readings. Because of the drift of the ice moving north, they had actually moved backward. Shackleton, realizing the futility, called a halt. He said, "We will camp here. Let the ice take us north." So began the Patience Camp. Life became a study of monotony and filth. They lived on a diet of seal meat and blubber. The blubber was fuel for the mind and body. It provided the calories needed to generate heat. But it covered everything. Their clothes were greasy and black with soot from the blubber stoves. Their faces were caked in grime because they couldn't wash. Fresh water was only for drinking. The menu of survival. Breakfast, fried seal steak. Lunch, cold seal meat, if available. Dinner, hoosh, a stew made of pemmican, dried beef and fat, water, and crushed biscuits. Treat, once a week, a lump of sugar. The greatest danger wasn't starvation yet. It was the killer whales, orcas. The ice floe was thinning. The orcas, massive beasts with dorsal fins slicing the water, would spy hop, poking their heads out of the water to look for seals on the ice. They knew how to break the ice from beneath to knock prey into the water. One night, the ice split directly under a tent. A sleeping bag, with a man inside, fell into the black water. Shackleton, hearing the scream, lunged forward. He grabbed the edge of the sleeping bag just as the ice began to snap shut like a pair of jaws. With a heave of adrenaline strength, he yanked the man out seconds before the 2 massive sheets of ice collided, which would have crushed the sailor to pulp. They were living on a time bomb. Chapter 9. The Lifeboat's Launch. April 9th, 1916. The end of the floe came swiftly. As the Antarctic summer ended and winter approached again, the swell of the open ocean began to smash the pack ice. Shackleton stood the watch. He felt the rise and fall of the Atlantic swell beneath his boots. The floe, which had once been a mile wide, was now a triangle barely 100 yards across. "Pack up," Shackleton yelled. "She's breaking."
A crack shot through the camp, separating the men from the boats. They had to jump across the widening fissure, throwing sleeping bags and stoves. They loaded the 3 boats. The James Caird, commanded by Shackleton and Wild, the heaviest, best boat. The Dudley Docker, commanded by Worsley. The Stancomb Wills, commanded by Tom Crean and Hudson, the smallest, leakiest boat. "Push off!" As the boat slid into the dark, slush-filled water, the men felt a strange mix of terror and relief. They were no longer passive passengers on the ice. They were sailors again. But the ocean they were entering was not kind. They were rowing into the roaring 40s and furious 50s, latitudes where the winds never stop and the waves grow to the size of houses. Night fell. The temperature dropped to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. The sea spray froze on their clothes, turning them into suits of armor. If a man stopped moving, he froze. Shackleton sat in the stern of the Caird. He sensed panic rising in the dark. A young sailor began to weep. Shackleton didn't scold him. He began to sing. His voice was cracked and dry, but loud enough to be heard over the wind. He sang calm, bawdy Navy songs. Slowly, one by one, other voices joined in. In the pitch black of the Southern Ocean, 28 freezing men sang to keep the madness at bay, rowing toward a rock in the middle of nowhere called Elephant Island. Chapter 10. The White Hell of the Sea. April 9th to April 15th, 1916. If the ice had been a prison, the open ocean was a torture chamber. For 7 days and nights, the 3 small boats, James Caird, Dudley Docker, and Stancomb Wills, battled the Southern Ocean. These were 22-foot whalers, open to the sky, designed for short trips from a mothership, not for navigating the roughest seas on the planet. The conditions were beyond human endurance. The cold. It was -20 degrees Fahrenheit, -29 degrees Celsius. The spray from the waves froze instantly on contact. The men's clothes turned into solid boards of ice. To move an arm required cracking the fabric. The thirst. This was the killer. They had run out of fresh water. They only had dry biscuits and salty pemmican. Their tongues swelled so much they could hardly breathe. Their lips cracked and bled. Some men began to drink seal blood just to wet their throats. The sleep. There was no sleep. The boats were overcrowded. Men lay in the bottom in a slurry of freezing water and vomit, while others sat on thwarts, shivering violently. Shackleton, in the James Caird, towed the slowest boat, the Stancomb Wills. He didn't sleep for 90 hours. He stood at the stern of the Caird, his beard a block of ice, scanning the gray water for the loom of land. On the 4th night, a massive storm hit. The boats lost sight of each other. In the Dudley Docker, Captain Worsley navigated by sheer instinct. He sat with the tiller tucked under his frozen arm, steering down the faces of 40-foot waves in the pitch black. If the boat broached, turned sideways, they would capsize and die in seconds. "Keep bailing," Worsley screamed over the wind. "Bail for your lives!" Miraculously, as dawn broke on the 7th day, the mist lifted. Ahead of them, jagged black cliffs tore through the clouds. Elephant Island. It wasn't paradise. It was a grim, glaciated mountain rising straight out of the sea. But it was solid ground. Chapter 11. The False Heathen. April 15th, 1916. Cape Valentine. The landing was chaotic. The men, half mad with thirst and exhaustion, threw themselves out of the boats and crawled up the pebble beach. They fell face first into a small glacial stream running down the rocks, drinking until they vomited, then drinking again. They laughed hysterically. They hugged the rocks. It was the first time in 496 days they had stood on land. But their joy was short-lived. Shackleton surveyed the beach. It was narrow and backed by sheer cliffs. High tide marks on the cliff walls told a terrifying story. During storms, this entire beach was underwater. They would be swept away. "We cannot stay here," Shackleton said, his voice heavy. They had to get back into the boats. They sailed 7 miles along the coast to a small spit of land that seemed safer. They named it Point Wild. It was a desolate spit of rocks and guano, open to the fury of the winds, but it was high enough to survive the tide. They flipped the 2 smaller boats, the Dudley Docker and Stancomb Wills, upside down to create a makeshift hut. They called it the Snuggery. 22 men crammed under 2 boat hulls, living like sardines in a tin, sleeping on rocks. Winter was closing in. The pack ice was forming around the island. They were trapped. Elephant Island was far outside any shipping lanes. No radio, no search party. The world thought they were dead. If they stayed here, they would starve or freeze. Shackleton walked the small beach, pacing back and forth. He looked north, toward the open ocean. He knew what he had to do. It was a suicide mission, but it was their only chance. He called Worsley and Wild. "I'm going to South Georgia," Shackleton said. Wild looked at him. South Georgia Island was 800 miles, 1,300 kilometers, across the Drake Passage, in winter. "It's the only way, boss," Wild agreed quietly. Chapter 12. Building the Ark. April 20th, 1916. The James Caird was the strongest of the three boats, but she was still just an open lifeboat. She would sink in the first gale of the Drake Passage. She needed to be decked over. Enter Harry Chippy McNeish, the carpenter. McNeish was a dour, grumpy Scotsman who despised Shackleton. He had rebelled on the ice, but he was a genius with wood. He was the only man who could make the boat seaworthy. Without proper lumber, McNeish had to improvise. He dismantled the packing crates that had held their food. He used the wood to build a makeshift deck over the boat. The sealant. They had no tar or caulk. McNeish used lamp wick and the oil paints from the artist's kit to seal the cracks. The caulk. He mixed seal blood with flour to create a sticky paste to plug the holes. The mast. They lashed the masts of the other boats together to strengthen them. The ballast. To stop the boat from capsizing, they filled canvas bags with shingle, rocks from the beach, about 1,000 pounds of wet rocks. The result was a Frankenstein's monster of a boat. It looked ragged, painted in odd colors, and smelled of blood, but it was their ark. The selection of the crew. Shackleton could only take 5 men. He chose carefully. Frank Worsley, captain, the best navigator in the expedition. If anyone could find a needle in a haystack, South Georgia, in a storm, it was him. Tom Crean, a giant Irishman, physically indestructible. He had already survived 2 previous Antarctic expeditions with Scott. Chippy McNeish. He was older, 40s, and troublesome, but Shackleton didn't want to leave a potential mutineer behind with Wild. Plus, they needed a carpenter if the boat broke. John Vincent and Timothy McCarthy, strong sailors, though Vincent was showing signs of physical collapse. On Easter Monday, April 24, 1916, the boat was pushed into the surf. The men remaining on Elephant Island stood on the beach. They were gaunt, ragged scarecrows. They gave 3 weak cheers. Shackleton stood in the stern of the James Caird. He waved once. "Don't worry, boys," he shouted. "We'll be back." He knew, and they knew, there was a very high chance they were watching him sail to his death. The James Caird bobbed on the gray swell, turned its nose north, and disappeared into the mist. The great boat journey had begun. Chapter 13. The Drake Passage. April 24th to May 5th, 1916. The Drake Passage is the narrow strip of ocean between Antarctica and South America. It is where the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans collide. There is no land to slow the wind for thousands of miles. The waves, known as Cape Horn rollers, can reach 60 to 80 feet in height. For the 6 men in the James Caird, life became a wet, freezing hell. The boat was 22 feet long. The deck McNeish built only allowed them to sit up. They could not stand. Below deck, they crawled over the wet rocks, ballast, in the dark. They slept in shifts, 3 men crammed into the bow, 3 men managing the sails. The routine: 1 man steered, 1 man bailed water, 1 man watched the sails. The navigation. This was the miracle. Worsley had to stand on the heaving boat, hugged by 2 men to keep him from falling overboard, and try to catch a glimpse of the sun or a star. The sky was almost always gray. If his calculation was off by even 1 degree, they would miss South Georgia and be swept out into the endless Atlantic to die of thirst. The Rogue Wave, midnight, May 5th. Shackleton was at the tiller. He was looking aft, backward, into the dark. he saw a clearing in the clouds, a line of white light. "It's clearing, boys!" he yelled to the men sleeping below. Then he realized it wasn't the sky. It was the white foam crest of a wave so massive it blocked out the stars. It stretched from horizon to horizon. A rogue wave. "Hold on! For God's sake, hold on!" The wave smashed them. The boat was buried. For agonizing seconds they were underwater, suspended in the black churning foam. The men held their breath, waiting for the crushing pressure of the depths. Then the James Caird shuddered and rose. She was half full of water, heavy and sluggish. "Bail! Bail!" Shackleton roared. They threw everything they had at the water, sleeping bags, the Primus stove, pots. They bailed for hours until their arms felt like they would fall off. They survived, but just barely. But the worst was to come. The water supply ran out. Chapter 14. Thirst and the Irony of Water. May 6th to May 7th, 1916. The ocean had failed to drown them, so now it tried to dry them out. They had run out of fresh water. The keg they had brought had been damaged during the loading, and salt water had seeped in, spoiling what little supply they had. For 48 hours they had nothing to drink. Their mouths were so swollen they could barely speak. Their tongues felt like pieces of dry leather filling their mouths. To make matters worse, they were surrounded by water, billions of gallons of it, but every drop was poison. The salt spray that soaked their beards and cracked lips was a constant torment. Shackleton, ever the psychological master, tried to distract them. "Imagine the streams at home," he rasped. "Think of the ice cream in London." It didn't help. Vincent, the strongest sailor when they started, had collapsed. He lay in the bottom of the boat, a dead weight. McCarthy was hallucinating. Even the indomitable Tom Crean was fading. Then, on May 8th, a piece of kelp floated by. Then a bird, a shag, flew overhead. "Land!" Worsley croaked. Through a break in the mist, they saw it. Black cliffs, snow-capped peaks, South Georgia. They had done the impossible. They had navigated a 22-foot boat across 800 miles of the worst ocean on Earth and hit a pinprick of an island. But the devil was in the details. Chapter 15. The Hurricane and the Needle's Eye. May 8th to May 10th, 1916. Just as they approached the coast, the sky turned a bruised purple. The barometer plummeted. A hurricane struck. It was one of the worst storms recorded in the region's history. A 500-ton steamer, the Argos, sank in the same storm nearby with all hands lost. The James Caird was a speck of wood in a washing machine of violence. For 9 hours they were battered. They were so close to the shore, they could hear the roar of the waves smashing against the invisible cliffs in the dark. But they couldn't land. If they got too close, they would be pulverized against the rocks. If they went too far out, they would be blown back into the Atlantic and die of thirst. They had to tack back and forth, holding their position by inches, fighting the wind with their last ounces of strength. "She won't hold!" Worsley yelled. "She must!" Shackleton roared back. At dawn on May 10th, the wind suddenly died. They saw a small inlet, King Haakon Bay. They steered the boat into the cove, but they were too weak to pull it up. They crashed onto the rocks. Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean stumbled out, fell to their knees, and drank from a glacial stream. "Fresh water," Crean whispered, tears mixing with the grime on his face. "Glorious fresh water!" They were alive, but they were on the wrong side of the island. Chapter 16. The Slide into the Void. May 19th, 1916. The whaling stations and the ships that could rescue their friends on Elephant Island were on the north coast. Between them and civilization lay the interior of South Georgia, a jagged spine of glaciers, peaks, and snowfields that had never been crossed by man. The boat was too damaged to sail around. The three weakest men, Vincent, McCarthy, and McNeish, could not walk. Shackleton made the decision. He would take Worsley and Crean. They would cross the mountains on foot. The gear for the crossing. Boots. Their boots were rotting. McNeish took screws from the James Caird and drove them into the soles of the boots to act as makeshift crampons for grip on the ice. Rope. 50 feet of frayed rope. Axe. A carpenter's adze. Map? None. The interior was a blank space on every chart. They said goodbye to the three men left under the overturned boat. "If we don't return," Shackleton said, "do the best you can." They began to climb. For hours they trudged up steep snow slopes. The fog rolled in. They reached a summit, only to find a sheer cliff dropping away on the other side. They had to backtrack. They climbed another peak, another cliff. Night was falling. They were at the top of a razorback ridge. The temperature was dropping rapidly. If they stayed on the ridge, they would freeze to death in their sleep. If they climbed down slowly in the dark, they would fall. Shackleton looked down into the swirling mist. He couldn't see the bottom. It might be a gentle slope, or it might be a 1,000-foot drop onto jagged rocks. "We have to slide," Shackleton said. Worsley and Crean looked at him like he was insane. Slide down a mountain? In the dark? Into the unknown? "It's the only way," Shackleton insisted. They sat on the snow, one behind the other. They locked their arms around each other's waists. They coiled the rope beneath them like a sled. Go. They launched themselves into the void. They plummeted. The wind screamed in their ears. They accelerated to 40, maybe 50 miles per hour. For seconds that felt like hours, they fell through the darkness, waiting for the impact that would kill them. Then the slope leveled out. They slowed. They came to a soft stop in a bank of deep snow. They stood up, shaking, checking for broken bones. They were unhurt. They had descended 1,500 feet in less than a minute. They laughed hysterically, shaking hands. "By God, boss, that was a ride!" Chapter 17. The Whistle of Civilization. May 20th, 1916, 7 a.m. They kept walking through the night. They were hallucinating now. Shackleton later wrote that he felt they were 4 of them, not 3, a 4th presence guiding them. As the sun rose, they heard a sound so alien to their ears they stopped dead. Whoo! It was the steam whistle of the whaling station at Stromness. It was the 7 o'clock call for the workers. "Did you hear that?" Shackleton asked. "I heard it," Worsley wept. They walked down the final valley. They encountered 2 small children playing near the outskirts of the station. The children saw the 3 bearded, black, terrifying monsters emerging from the wilderness and ran away screaming. They reached the manager's house. Thorolf Sorley, the manager, came to the door. He looked at the 3 ragged scarecrows standing before him. He didn't recognize them, although he had met Shackleton years before. "Who the hell are you?" Sorley asked. The man in the center, despite his rags, straightened his back. "My name is Shackleton. We have lost our ship," he said softly. Sorley's eyes widened. He turned away and wept. Chapter 18. Not a Life Lost. August 30th, 1916. Elephant Island. The rescue was not immediate. It took 4 attempts. The pack ice around Elephant Island was impenetrable. First, Shackleton tried a whaler, the Southern Sky, stopped by ice. Then a Uruguayan trawler, stopped by ice. Then a British schooner, failed. Finally, the Chilean government lent him a small steam tug, the Yelcha. It was not an icebreaker. It was a rusty little boat. But Shackleton begged the captain, Luis Pardo, to try. On August 30th, the mist cleared around Elephant Island. The men on the beach were boiling seal bones for soup. "Ship! Ship!" someone screamed. They ran to the water's edge. They waved their arms. They lit a signal fire. Shackleton stood on the bridge of the Yelcha, peering through his binoculars. His heart was hammering. Had they survived? Had they starved? Had they frozen? He counted the tiny figures. 1, 2, 3, 4. He counted 22. He lowered the binoculars. He turned to Worsley. "They are all there, Skipper," he said, his voice breaking. "They are all there." He then sent a message to the world, a simple telegram that has become legendary. "I have arrived, all safe, all well." Epilogue: The Enduring Spirit. They returned to a world at war. Many of the men who survived the ice went on to fight and die in the trenches of World War I. Shackleton never conquered the continent. He died of a heart attack in South Georgia in 1922, at the age of 47, on yet another expedition. He is buried there, among the whalers. But the Endurance expedition remains his greatest triumph. In the face of overwhelming odds, facing the cruelest environment on the planet, he did not lose a single man. It is a story that reminds us that while we cannot control the forces of nature, we can control how we respond to them. It is the ultimate testament to the human capacity to endure. The end.